Okay, I'd like to call this committee of the whole meeting to order. It is, what day is it? Let's see. No, I know that, but what day of the week? That's what I'm looking for. Tuesday, May 27th at 6 p.m. Addie, would you call the roll?
Larson.
Here.
Maddox.
Here.
Russell.
Here.
Posh.
Here.
Cobb.
Here.
Kuda.
Here.
Petrus.
Here.
All right, we're here to discuss one particular piece of legislation. Addie, would you mind reading that into the record?
Ordinance number 055-2025, an ordinance amending various sections of Part 11 zoning code of the codified ordinances of the city of Cleveland Heights as part of the Livable Neighborhoods Initiative and declaring the necessity that this legislation become immediately effective as an emergency measure.
All right, so I think what we'll do here is we'll kind of have three parts to this. I think the planning department, are we represented here? Yes, there we go. You're going to make a presentation? Okay, so we'll do the presentation. If council has questions for staff, we'll do that. And then we're going to have public comment until everybody who signed up will talk.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Just before we start, just to let everyone know, I apologize. I have to step out at 6:30. It's my son's graduating this year from Heights. So it's crazy, all the events and ceremonies today. But I'll finish watching. So
all right,
thank
very
you for
good.
that, and congratulations to all the seniors. Thank you.
Yeah, that's this time of year. All right, Director Zanft and Assistant Director Knittel.
Thank you, Council President, Council, for having this public hearing. It's been a long time in the making, and we wanted to walk you through the entire Livable Neighborhoods Initiative and the thinking about this specific piece of legislation. And we wanted to use that paradigm of who, what, when, where. As Council President mentioned, three parts to the public hearing tonight. Our presentation, council questions and comments, and then public comments. So we wanted to start with why. Why are we doing this Livable Neighborhoods Initiative at all? So communities throughout the U.S. have been looking at neighborhoods and zoning. It's something that's developed over time. In fact, for millennia, people lived a certain way, and then for some reason in the 20th century, communities came in and they did zoning, which separated out all uses. So in the later part of the 20th century, 21st century, communities have been trying to restitch that. And so you see here some examples of communities that are doing that. On the top right is Milwaukee. They called it Growing MKE. Cleveland just has their new form-based code, and their tagline is a user-friendly, predictable code to preserve and enhance Cleveland's neighborhoods. And Houston has Livable Places Houston, more option for Houstonians, making communities more equitable, walkable, and affordable. And this is all in that paradigm of looking at our neighborhoods, looking at housing options, but also looking at non-residential uses in those neighborhoods, like the corner store that used to exist that doesn't necessarily exist anymore. And this is all wrapped up in form-based codes that have been trending over the past decade or so. And something that we've said here to the community since the beginning, which zoning is our living, breathing documents, which means they're always changing, they're always evolving, and they should be changing and evolving. So what led us to develop our own Livable Neighborhoods Initiative? Well, there was a first cut at proposed places of worship legislation back in 2024. The Planning Commission, as you'll see in a second, does annual code reviews per the code every year, and they also see cases that come before them, and these are things that started to trend. The county did a single-family zoning analysis. The county did a TOD zoning study. The Greater Ohio Policy Center has a pattern book. We did our North Coventry and North Noble and our Noble Road corridor planning studies, and we had the ADU ongoing work. And of course, council's residential zoning tiny home requests that we discussed at the end of last year. So there's all these things that were coming together to say, we need to have an initiative that looks at these things sort of comprehensively. And so that led to the Livable Neighborhoods Initiative, which really has three components, which are places of worship, that's the subject of tonight, residential typologies, and non-residential uses in residential neighborhoods, which will be the subject of further legislation down the road. But what it is in a nutshell, it's an effort to examine our residential neighborhood regulations more comprehensively and potentially to propose changes to make the city's neighborhoods more resilient, vibrant, and livable. So I'm going to pass it over to Karen, who's going to walk you through why we chose places of worship first, and then what some of the details are, and then I'll hop back in right at the very end to talk about some of the process.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here tonight. So let me see if I can get there. There we go. So why did we start with places of worship? What you already heard from Eric was that there's already been some national trends. We've seen some cases through our Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals, and there's been some incidences and going on. So we wanted to take a look at places of worship. As you know, historically, the places of worship have been in grand, large buildings. And you can see historically today, people are not necessarily worshiping in that same manner. And so we wanted to take a look at what do we need to be doing. So places of worship are located in our residential districts. They tend to be large setbacks. They tend to be grand structures, and they're intended to be that, something that's stately and really draws your eye to them. They often are tall and don't necessarily fit in with the scale of the balance of the neighborhoods. And there's currently limited standards on what a place of worship needs to do to be a good neighbor in the community. We also have meeting rooms that are located in our commercial districts, and they also serve as places of worship, so places where people can gather and talk, a meeting room, but they have no real standards either. So this kind of led us to thinking through that our zoning code needed to be looked at and updated. So again, looking at the why, national trends are that congregations are getting smaller. We've seen that in Cleveland Heights, where some congregations have combined and some of our church buildings have been reused in other fashions. And we unfortunately have seen some places, neighborhoods where the congregation shrunk to a point where they couldn't support their grand structure, and they could not find a location here in Cleveland Heights in order to meet. And so they had to move outside the community. So we know that congregations were looking for buildings and often found that it was difficult to find a location. And what we unfortunately found in Cleveland Heights, sometimes they were locating in spaces that were not designed for assembly and were not safe for congregations. And so what we want to do is make sure that we have buildings and policies and procedures in place so that we can assure that it's a safe place for people to gather. So why start with Planning Commission? And I wanted to review again their role. The Planning Commission, as you know, reviews conditional use permits. So any use in our community that's a conditionally permitted use by zoning regulation, the Planning Commission is the board that really reviews the standards of that conditional use and assure that that use will be a good neighbor in the community. They also have the role of annually reviewing our zoning code. And again, this is by statute and in our zoning regulation that their intent of this board is to take a look at our Planning Commission, our zoning code. So that's why the Planning Commission is so involved in this places of worship regulation. So because of these reasons, staff started talking with the Planning Commission actually 3 years ago. In October of 2022, we started having some discussions with them. We were reviewing different standards throughout the United States. We looked closely at some of our neighboring communities that were feeling some pressures around places of worship and had either amended their code or had some litigation resulting from their places of worship regulations. We reached out to different faith-based community members within Cleveland Heights, and we heard back from them, and some of that informed what we proposed then in the zoning regulations. We also talked with fire and police. We created the frequently asked questions, which is posted online. And then ordinance number 31-2024 was introduced. It was ultimately withdrawn by the mayor. But after withdrawing it, the staff continued to do additional research, including looking at existing places of worship in communities and parking standards. We know that parking is always something that we always are concerned about, and we looked at specifically a few of the places included North Ridgeville and Yellow Springs. We also went out in the community and evaluated the impact of our current places of worship in our neighborhoods, and we used our new software, Gridix, which is where our zoning code now is housed, and it has mapping capabilities to take a look at setbacks and height and try to really understand that impact a little bit better. On December 18th, we had an administrative work session, and we reviewed all of that analysis during that session, so we're not going to go through all that individual analysis of setbacks and heights, but it is on a YouTube, so if you want to look at it, it's there for people to take a look at and see that analysis work. In March of 2025, the proposed zoning code amendment was posted online for public review. This was intentional so that folks could start looking at it and thinking about it and how it might impact them. On April 7th, then the formal zoning code amendment process began, and City Council introduced your ordinance number 55-2025, and then referred it to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission on May 14th reviewed that ordinance and recommended approval, which sent it back to City Council, and that's why we're here tonight for this public hearing on the zoning code amendment. So this timeline, I think, is really important. We wanted to show that during this process, we've had over 11 public discussions of places of worship over the past 3 years. There have been 8 public presentations by staff on this topic. Of course, 2 ordinances were prepared. 3 Planning Commission resolutions around places of worship were passed, and there have been over 40 comments as of 5 o'clock tonight about places of worship. About 87.5% of those are in support of the zoning regulation amendments. So why have a zoning amendment change, and what is the intent? The intent is to permit a range of religious structures that are contextual to both our neighborhoods and our corridors and nodes and the buildings that they're located in. Specifically, we wanted to distinguish between a community place of worship, which is what we think of now as our traditional grand places of worship, neighborhood places of worship, and then those meeting rooms that are in our commercial districts. We wanted to tie these back to our existing standards. And then we also, and this is really important, and we're actually quite pleased about this, we amended our standards for parking and landscaping for conditional use permits globally. So any conditional use permit that's within our residential districts will have to follow these guidelines. And we think that they're good guidelines because we're looking at how parking impacts that neighborhood and how landscaping impacts neighborhood. And so then the conditional permit, a conditionally permitted use, just to remind everybody, means that it's continually reviewed by the zoning administrator as well as the planning commission oversight. So it's something that you don't just get it and we forget about you. You have to live up to those standards that you agreed to when you came in and made application. So let's go ahead and review what those different categories are. So the community place of worship is conditionally permitted in our AA, B, and multifamily residential districts, as well as in our C districts. They have large setbacks. Their square footage would be 8,000 square feet or greater. They can be tall structures, and then they can have accessory uses, and there's standards that are specified within the zoning code for this conditional use now. Our meeting room pretty much stays unchanged. These are permitted as an accessory use in a multifamily district. So we know that sometimes in our residential apartment buildings, there may be a community room or something that could have a meeting room where folks gather to talk about whatever, and it could be something in terms of a place of worship discussion. They're conditionally permitted in our commercial districts, and they're what we think of as storefronts. Then this is the newest category, which is the neighborhood place of worship. It would be conditionally permitted in our AA, A, and B districts, so that's our residential districts. The setback would match the existing residential setbacks that are on that street. It would be 8,000 square feet or less. Now, that doesn't mean the footprint is 8,000 square feet. It could be a 2-story structure, but the total square footage would be maxed out at 8,000 square feet. It must be contextual. So like everything in our community, it has to fit into the neighborhood and look as though it belongs there. And there are accessory uses and standards, as well as signage standards that are spelled out in our zoning code, so that we have specific guidelines that this use has to follow, and which would be reviewed with the Planning Commission prior to a conditional use being granted. So balancing parking and landscaping. I told Eric that I should have learned how to juggle, and I could have been juggling some Hot Wheels with you for this one, but this is true. Everything in life is about balance. And so we know that parking is always a challenge. So we want to be sure that there is a balance. We had a really good discussion around an auto use recently that changed ownership along Mayfield Road. And when a conditionally permitted use changes ownership, they come back to Planning Commission for a new conditional use. But it allowed us to, again, talk to them about how are your cars queuing up on your property? Are they spilling out onto the street? Is there parking on the residential street, and how are you impacting it? And then setting up rules and guidelines to make sure that that impact is kept to a minimal and that they can perform the way they need to perform. So here's the updated regulation that I told you we were really pleased to have come to, which is these are the regulations that would apply to any conditionally permitted use. So the first is that parking shall not create an undue shortage on the street, and that you cannot have a negative impact on the existing residential properties or businesses. And the second one is that you need to develop a parking management plan. So tell us, based on the zoning code, how many parking spaces does the zoning code call out that you need to have? And then where are you going to place these vehicles, and where is that parking going to take place? So we want to have a statement of how much traffic you think you might generate and how frequently, because we know that different uses have different levels of impact depending on what day of the week it is or what day or what hour of the day it may be. So we want to understand that a little bit. So this parking management plan will help to call that out and give us some cues as to questions we need to understand better or have them fully explain. Then there would be a map that would show you their anticipated, if they were going to use any on-street parking, where would this on-street parking occur? That's part of the balance I was talking about earlier. The last thing we want to do is see our neighborhoods torn down, or even near our commercial districts. We know it's a concern that homes are going to be torn down for additional parking. So if we are able to utilize some on-street parking without having a negative impact on the residences, we want to be able to do that. So then also the management plan, they can call out if they have experience elsewhere in Ohio that they can show us the impact of their parking and how their frequency of use, how much traffic it generates. They can share that with us also. This parking plan then would be reviewed by the zoning administrator with our fire and chief of police so that we could have a good understanding of it before they would come to the planning commission for a conditional use permit, so that we would completely feel comfortable with what the parking management plan was saying. It also importantly includes a contact person. So should there be something unfortunate that occurs at any given hour, there's a person that we can contact and make sure that they can address it immediately. So some of the specifics that got tweaked in this, because we created two categories of places of worship. A community place of worship would be required to have one parking space for every 8 seats, and a neighborhood place of worship would have one space for each 300 square feet of assembly space. So spaces where people would stay for the purpose of worship. And then signage. The community place of worship signage regulations didn't change. They're allowed to have 24 square feet of a freestanding sign. For a neighborhood place of worship, we thought a 6 square foot, which could be a 2 foot by 3 foot plaque along the frontage. So either the street frontage, the primary street frontage, or the secondary street frontage, they would be allowed to have that. So here we are to the how and the process. So again, this is the formal zoning administration changes process. So the ordinance was introduced by City Council and referred to Planning Commission on April 7th. Planning Commission did consider that ordinance and made recommendation to City Council for approval on May 14th, which brings us to tonight's public hearing. Again, this is another opportunity for public input, and then action by City Council potentially could occur on June 16th. I'm not sure if you wanted to step back in.
Yes, so we wanted to, we know tonight is a little bit about education. Some people might be coming to this for the first time or digging into it for the first time, and we want to let you know that all the information is up on our website. It's been up actually since March the 7th, but it gets supplemented as new information comes in. That includes the ordinance itself, a summary of the amendments, so you don't have to read through the red line, the Planning Commission resolution, the FAQ, which is those frequently asked questions, and we try to insert questions that we get through the comments, and then the comments received. So both the FAQ and the comments need to be updated based upon comments received today. You can always email your questions or comments to the clerk or to planning@clevelandheights.gov. But really, this is the point where hopefully we have given people some, and including yourselves, some more information to think about. But certainly visit this site to educate yourself further on this.
All right, well, thank you very much. Before I go to council to ask questions, I just want to say that I want you to feel free to ask any question. And I don't want the questions to be misconstrued as a point of view. We have an obligation to scrutinize every piece of legislation that comes before us. and I want you to be, again, comfortable with any question. Did you want to go first?
Thank you,
You
Mr.
gotta
President.
step out.
I appreciate that. My questions, I just wanted to say, I was well aware when this initiated, and just for the public, I wanted them to know how much you engage with all faiths to communicate this, to get information on this. You all went above and beyond to really reach out and connect with people to bring clarity to this. And so I want the public to know this isn't something that was just fly by night. You've invested a lot of time in that, and I appreciate it. Many of the faith leaders that I know, they were reached out to, engaged in. Many of them didn't get an opportunity to reach back out, but just the thought of that. And so I do want the public to know that you went out of your way to make sure that you reached out to different faith groups to really share this information and bring clarity. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, as a pastor, as I'm thinking about this, and I want to share this with the public, this issue is huge. And the reason I'm saying that is regardless of the size of the congregation, putting a church in the middle of a residential neighborhood absolutely could have some type of impact just based on the faith or the denomination. For an example, my church would be considered a charismatic church. So we're much, much louder in worship than in some of my brothers and sisters, maybe in my Episcopal pastor friends in their church. And so the experience that they would have while we're in worship would be night and day from someone else. And so I'm thinking about that in terms of not just one particular faith group, but all faith groups and experiences that they may bring to this. And so that's one of the things that I just wanted to bring up. And the other thing is, I know that as churches, we tend to worship inside, but in terms of having impact in the community, we do things outside. And so I'm really thinking about what outdoor worship or events looks like in that area at around that time when if you do a festival or something in a parking lot, what does that look like? And so I'm gauging that as well, just thinking from a pastor standpoint. And then just the crowds and again, the parking, just based on, I could have 900 people in for a funeral out of nowhere and not know it, And so just planning for that and really thinking about what that does to the neighborhood. In East Cleveland, our church, for example, we do evening worship services, but because we're on a residential street, we're very careful of when those end. So just thinking about the timing, thinking about when you're doing events during the holidays, if other folks are parking on the street, and just being cognizant. I think there's just a lot to think about in terms of putting a worship center in a residential neighborhood, and then just letting people know that just because that is the worship center that's there now doesn't mean that another type of faith center would move in later, and it might change the nature or the culture of that neighborhood and that shift. And so these are just some of the things that I'm just thinking about for my colleagues as I'm thinking about it from a pastor standpoint and how we impact the neighborhoods just based on our worship and our events. And so I'm just looking forward to hearing the comments tonight. But thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me to do that before I left.
Questions? Councilman Posh?
How do you deal with the safety and health issues in these structures? So if you take a residential home, now you're going to have 30, 40 people in there. Are you going to require sprinklers or you're not? I mean, how does that
So that's an excellent question. So we have to remember that we have multiple codes within Cleveland Heights. So what we're looking at tonight is just the zoning code. However, these would become places of assembly, and so they would have to follow the building code for places of assembly, not for a residential home. So those building and fire codes would need to be met prior to occupancy permits being issued.
Go ahead.
Yes. Are there any limits to how many places of worship can be on one street or within the radius?
The zoning code does not currently state that. However, just from a practical standpoint, we have a community where people love to live, and our residential properties have a good value. So I would not anticipate that every residential home is going to want to convert into a place of worship. I think that just the economics of that would not make it feasible. But it's something that, should we feel like there's a need to look at, I guess we could look at that.
I guess I wasn't per se talking about every home, but maybe like one block, maybe 4 blocks over another home or something like that. I'm not sure. We were talking about something different in the community that you're working on, how we started one thing and things start popping up everywhere. So I was just wondering, is there a ratio of how many in a certain neighborhood?
We didn't come across that in any of the codes we reviewed, but that doesn't mean it's not something we couldn't consider should that be a desire.
Okay.
Along with that, I was just curious, something else popped in my mind because you mentioned that there are a lot of current worship centers around town, storefronts, in people's homes currently. Are we thinking about something to proactively or go back and register those folks or find a way or a system to do that? Because just in my head, I know of 6 right now that I know the city isn't aware of that are all of just renting spaces around. And so I'm just curious if this is also a way to kind of control that. I'm thinking kind of like how we talked about with the Airbnbs, just at least having some type of registry so that we could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll see in our FAQ, we address that issue. So there'll be a proactive effort to reach out to the ones that we know about, and maybe the ones that we don't know about, we'll hear through the grapevine. But it's certainly something that's important because in reality, most of the new places of worship will be existing ones that just become legal.
Councilwoman Larson?
Thank you. I just have 2 questions. When you talk about on-street parking and you talk about the negative impact, how do you define negative impact?
So, you know, the Planning Commission has done a great job with conditional use, and so they really look at neighborhoods and issues and questions. So obviously, if there's a lot of concerns and we're hearing it from the public, obviously there's an issue and a problem. I don't know that there's a definition that I can just read to you about that. It's really every situation's a little bit different, and that's the nuance that's difficult, but also why that parking management plan is so essential so that we can be sure that we have context and an understanding of what they're intending to do. And I think, too, we can look at, you know, if they are intending to use on-street parking, how realistic is their parking? Are they parking bumper to bumper and 50 cars where you or I might think only 10 cars could park? So I think there's some, you know, just common sense review that we can do, but then also just discussing it through with the applicant to make sure that there's an equitable arrangement for the neighborhood also.
And the second question, when we do get an application for a neighborhood service I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with that terminology, but place of worship, neighborhood place of worship. Will the neighbors be notified that that's going to be in front of the Planning Commission?
Yes, with all Planning Commission, especially conditional use permit applications, there's actually a requirement within the zoning code to notify neighbors, so they would get a mailing directly to them. Yeah.
All right, great, thank you.
Other questions? Councilman Petrus?
Thank you, Mr. President. Looking at the FAQ, number 13 asks, could places of worship be used for any other use? And the first sentence in the response is yes, but such uses would have to be accessory or secondary and related to the religious aspect. So for clarification, am I understanding that a neighborhood place of worship would not be able to also be used as a residence?
So the way the neighborhood places of worship regulations are written, it could not be, because the primary use would be the place of worship. Now that's something that, you know, if we wanted to allow a small apartment for the clergy or for a caretaker, it's something that we could consider as an accessory use to the place of worship, but the primary use would be the assembly place of worship.
Okay.
Is that right?
Mr. President?
Thank you.
Could we clear that up? So you can't have it both?
Correct. Currently, your primary use would be place of worship. So you have to have a primary use under the zoning code. So currently, the way it's written, you would come in as a place of worship. We did not, in our current code, write in an accessory use as a dwelling unit. However, if that was something that is desired, we could allow an accessory use to the place of worship to be a dwelling of a certain size.
Go ahead.
That's one of the things, and I'm glad Councilman brought that up, because I was curious in terms of some smaller congregations do still consider themselves in a place where they can have a rectory or something where they're trying to build out that ministry with the pastor. And so I was wondering that as well, what that looks like and how to balance that out, because I'm noticing that that's happening even in smaller churches to save funds. They're bringing the pastor and allowing them to live on site. And I know in many of our traditional churches right now that is happening with some priests. And so I was just curious what that looks like in this arrangement as well. In addition to his other question, I know that at least in the denominations that I'm dealing with, almost every church in this day and age is doing other things inside of their facility to help bring in income. And so I was wondering about that as well, because you see everything from parties to bingo to renting out halls for birthday parties. And so I'm just curious what that looks like, because it's a completely different environment than the worship. And so I was wondering how we would handle that as well, or if that would be permitted, because that's something, at least in my experience from faith-based church, it happens all the time, from repasses on down. If the church can rent it out for something and get some money, they will. And so I'm just wondering, on those off worship times, what that may look like in terms of experiences in the neighborhood, or if that's something that we could kind of put some parameters around.
So we did include some of that if you look through the regular standards, and we would, during the conditional use process, inquire about the frequency, like how often do you think something like this is going to happen? But it is traditional for most places of worship to have, for example, weddings or some type of celebration of a new life, or, as you said, for a repass. So those are typical things that we would expect to see in a place of worship.
Yes. Aren't churches exempt from taxes? Anthony? Are churches exempt from taxes?
Yeah, we're exempt from property taxes.
So what?
And there's a caveat to that, though. We have to own that building, and that building has to be used for that faith-based worship. So just because we're in there, it doesn't automatically make it that way. We've got to own it, and that has to be the use. So if it's in someone else's name, no.
So how would that work with house of worships?
So this is a zoning, proposed zoning text amendments, and taxes obviously are a different issue, but if it's not in the FAQ, it should be in the FAQ. We do have a rough calculation of what the tax implications are of a typical residential property converting over to a place of worship, and it amounts to 47 cents per year per person in this community. So of our 44,000 people, their tax bill would go up 47 cents because of that conversion.
Other questions? Have there been any lawsuits in any cities that have passed an ordinance, a zoning ordinance like this?
I mean,
Regarding
we did look at University Heights. They were in litigation, so that's an example of a location that did have a lawsuit. But I'm not aware of places that proactively were changing these standards that were then sued.
So in the 80s, there was this case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, where this was about an education institution where a teacher, and like a non-sectarian teacher, was asked to come in and teach in a private school. And then basically what happened was they decided that, the person said, well, I'm just an English teacher, I'm not teaching religion, so we could be paid with public dollars. And I don't want to get into that case as much as I want to say that what was found in that case is that there was an excessive entanglement between government and this policy, if you will, this legislation. What I'm a little concerned about is the checking of, is what's supposed to be going on there, and how much does this involve government checking? To get a tax exempt status, you have to prove that you're tax exempt. And I think, Director Zanft, you said in your remarks, just because, or maybe it was Ms. Knittel, I don't know, but that just because you were granted the a conditional use, that it would be still checked on. What I'm concerned about is that excessive entanglement of government having to check to make sure that it is indeed doing what they said they were going to be doing.
So we had many, many conversations with our law department and law director about these proposed regulations. I know some of those concerns have popped up earlier in the first iteration, and where we ended up with applying these standards to conditional uses globally and not calling out one type of use, i.e. a religious use over another, was a very, very important point that they made. So by the fact that we're asking for every conditional use, no matter what it is, to provide a parking plan, then allows the governmental authority to maintain, observe, and enforce, if need be, that global standard, not targeting one specific use or one specific property.
Yeah, you're missing my point. kind of by a lot. So let me restate it. This isn't about whether, this would target one religion or another religion. That's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is when somebody is granted a conditional use permit for whatever religion, for every religion, somebody evidently, according to what Ms. Knittel said, is going to have to go and check to see if that's indeed what's happening. That's what I'm asking. That's the entanglement I'm talking about.
So I maybe chose my words carelessly.
Okay.
Once you have a conditional use permit, you have it. But should something arise that changes, then you do come back to the Planning Commission for permission. So if they were going to change their parking plan, for example, and change how they were going to park, we would bring them back and review that issue. With any of our conditional uses, should change of ownership. So if one place of worship moved out and they were selling it to a different denomination and they were moving in, they would come in for a new conditional use. But it also enables, if we get questions, a lot of questions and concerns, it enables us to go to that location, whether it's a business or a place of worship, whoever has that conditional use, and say, we have standards that you agreed to operate by. We're hearing from the neighbors and the community that you're not operating the way you stated. We need you to come into compliance. And should they not work with staff and come into compliance to those standards, then we can bring them back to the Planning Commission at a meeting and formally review their conditional use and add additional standards up to even revoking it should they say they cannot meet those standards.
Mr. President,
Yes.
just to go along with that, just so the public understands, that's with any conditional use permit, unless there's some type of change or a complaint, they wouldn't go in to just inspect these businesses that way. So they don't go into churches just to see if we're still operating that way. But if it's triggered, 100%, our chairwoman, Jessica Cohen, they would go right back to her committee, which is what happens when those businesses pull in and get it revoked or at least investigated.
Yeah, I think I understand this now.
But,
Thank you.
they don't go into the worship institutions.
Any other questions before we go to public comment? All right, well, let's do it.
Michael Bending. Oh.
Furthest person away.
Hi, Michael Bending. I live on Edge Hill Road. So I think, can I raise the mic? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so I think part of upholding our motto of all are welcome is trying to accommodate the needs of different groups in our community. I'm told part of the reason that this is here is because some groups want to kind of meet and congregate in our neighborhoods, and our zoning isn't set in stone. If part of Cleveland Heights wants to do something different, I think we should seriously look at how we can accommodate it. Groups of people meeting in a neighborhood, in my opinion, is the sign of a vibrant community, and it's something we should celebrate and encourage. When I first heard about this, I was pretty excited. I'm not religious myself, but I like the idea of people trying to build something and build community here in Cleveland Heights. I know there are concerns about the plan, and I hope that we can take this as an opportunity to look to how we can take those concerns and get to a yes. We shouldn't ignore concerns, but I think we can hopefully try to address those and not shut things down. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Jessica Cohen.
Hi, it's good to see everyone. My name is Jessica Cohen. I'm the chair of the Cleveland Heights Planning Commission, as now everybody knows. And I am coming to you with bring a message of support from all 7 members, including myself, of the Planning Commission. We are incredibly proud of the work that went into this proposed zoning code changes. We've worked for almost 3 years on this, and I want to congratulate and thank our incredible planning department staff for all of the hard work that they did on this. And just to give you in contrast, the last kind of major zoning code change that we made was the parking garage changes. That was done in 3 months. So this is we really wanted to get the sense of the community. And more than that, we wanted to take the time to get this right. So I want to, and in addition, the only other distinction I want to make is that this is the only proposed zoning code change that I'm aware of where we've had an online public comment process. As a regulatory attorney, I love that, but this is new, and this is all about our Planning Commission's interest in getting as much community feedback as we can. And just in my remaining time, I want to put on the record for the public how the Planning Commission works, because I know there are some questions. Zoning code changes, as we've talked about, give a global change, right, for across the community to allow particular conditional uses. But each particular use has to come back to the Planning Commission for consideration that is very fact specific, that provides and requires notice to neighbors, as we've already discussed tonight, that allows neighbors to know what is actually happening in their neighborhood. And right now, if a house of worship is existing in a home, nobody would know. And more importantly, no neighbor would have any recourse to come to the city and say, this use is injurious to my property, and I would like the city to correct that or investigate that or see how we could remedy that because there's too much parking on my street or there's too much noise after a certain time. And so for us, this is about giving neighbors and residents the leverage and the recourse to be able to come to us. I will say, in 10 years of being on the Planning Commission, we've only ever considered 2 revocations of conditional use permits, but it does happen. We do take them seriously, and we make sure that residents are heard. And lastly, I want to say, just in the course of granting or considering a conditional use permit, we consider all sorts of things, and we can impose whatever conditions we deem necessary to make sure that it doesn't change the character of the neighborhood. That includes timing of hours, number of people and maximum capacity, the size of the building, setbacks, whether it's injurious to the neighborhood, what type of events can and cannot be had in that building. So the authority of the Planning Commission is broad, and we have the ability to really listen to residents and neighbors and make sure that that use is not injurious to them, but also consistent with the goals and the tenor of our neighborhoods. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bonita Person.
Hi, I live on Cadwell, and we're on a street where I go down onto Hampshire. There is a church at the corner of Hampshire and a Superior. And if you want to go down or even come up Hampshire when on a Sunday or even on a Tuesday night, that's a safety hazard. And it's in a neighborhood, at the end of a neighborhood. So I don't understand why there is a need for these places to be in residential areas. You want to put them in mixed use or you want to put them in commercial, that's fine. There's no room in the neighborhood that I'm around for any parking at all. So I don't get it. And the thing about 47 cents per person for property taxes aren't per person. Property taxes are $100,000 per your value of your thing. So why should I or any other resident have to pay more in Cleveland Heights taxes, which are quite high to begin with, to have somebody in a neighborhood just have a place of worship? There are specific places of worship, and that's where they should be. Thank you.
Yakov Berger.
Hi, good evening. I'm here to express support for the proposed Neighborhood Houses of Worship zoning amendment. Neighborhoods thrive when people have a place, local places, to gather, reflect, and support one another. Houses of worship play a vital role, not just spiritually, but also as centers of community care and connection. This amendment is a thoughtful, balanced update. It expands access without compromising neighborhood character or quality of life. I urge you to pass it and help make our city more inclusive, compassionate, and responsive to community needs. Thank you for your time and your service.
Robin Coslin.
Hello, my name is Robin Coslin, and I live on Wood Road. So, Jessica, I just feel so left out of this conversation. This is my neighborhood too, and maybe I'm negligent and not civically involved. I think everybody would have to laugh at that, but I didn't know I was supposed to be adding community input to this process. It just blindsided me. And this is my neighborhood. I live in the neighborhood, it's mine. So I do have problems with granting tax exempt, property tax exemption. And I'm going to tell you, I hate that we're talking about at the top of the hill, the piece that Volpe wants, property tax exemption. I want everybody to be taxed, so I don't have to pay more taxes. And so when you take a piece of property out, that by nature means somebody else has to pick it up. And so we will be picking it up, and it might be 47 cents per house on one house, but how many other properties are going to be leaving? And so I have to pay more because we've removed properties. The traffic, Maple Road is crazy. And, you know, I go to work in the morning at 9 o'clock and getting out of my street is difficult. And it takes a long time. And I sometimes cut over to Park Hill, but that too is, what are we going to do about the parking? The traffic. I want to know how you're going to deal with violators. And I want to know how you're going to deal with people who cross that line between it being residential and a place of worship, because it seems like that's a really fuzzy line. And it seems like it's opening the door for everybody who doesn't want to pay property taxes, just say, I'm a place of worship, and I wonder how you're going to deal with it. I would like to have notification since it is my neighborhood. And I think that's it. Thank you.
All right, before we call the next person, Assistant Law Director, are we here? Yeah, I don't know if this is for you or who wants to answer this, but my understanding about the tax exempt is that that is federal and not something that, you know, involves the local government. Is that true?
Actually, Mr. President, two things. First, it is state law and federal law that exempts religious or charitable institutions from taxation. It's not local law. Our zoning code does not create tax exemption. So it is not municipal law that creates that tax exemption, state law and federal law. But I did want to just address one other thing that Ms. Coslin mentioned. I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware. This zoning change impacts the entire city. This is not specific to one neighborhood. I know that Ms. Coslin mentioned a particular neighborhood, but this is not exclusive to any particular neighborhood in our city. This is a citywide change.
Yeah,
I just wanted to make
that. I just wanted to make sure that anybody here didn't think that this was something that we could either implement or waive, you know, as far as the tax exempt status. Go ahead.
Isaac Summer.
Name is Isaac Summer. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to express my feelings. I'm very supportive of the amendment, primarily as a middle-aged adult with a family. I appreciate and see the necessity for a place where can accommodate elders that are not able to walk on Sabbath down to Taylor Road or wherever, maybe an extended distance from the home, as well as we much appreciate and encourage children to attend and be part of any kind of service. And as a result of that, it creates difficulty when children are unable to reach the place where they need to go on their own, or just tremendous convenience and allows for certain things to happen that wouldn't be possible otherwise. At the same time, I do want to highlight the sensitivity of not impacting residents, and I think that's something that needs to be, and it seems like it's been very, very much on the forefront of all considerations. And I would hope that whatever is done is whatever is proposed and implemented should not be at the cost and detriment of residents. But just to sum up, and once again, I feel that's something that's extremely beneficial for the community to thrive as a community, and people get together and becomes optimum place for communities to live. So thank you.
Susan Ephraimson.
Susan Ephraimson, 3825 Severn Road. There's a 1927 poem called Desiderata, and it gives lists a number of good advice. And one is to pray to your God however you conceive him to be. The 12-step program refers to a higher power. And the Hebrew word lehis palel can also be translated to judge oneself, which teaches us that inevitably, when one comes before their higher power, however they conceive him to be, and asks for sustenance, good health, peace, and does so day after day, he has to ask himself, am I a better person today than I was yesterday? Am I kinder? Am I more worthy? These thoughts are very healthy thoughts and should be encouraged, especially in our marvelously diverse city. And this legislation supports that equally for all faiths. It acknowledges the needs for more venues and accommodates the ever-changing ways in which people worship. At the same time, it allows the city to ensure and enforce safety. It is therefore my hope that you will pass this resolution.
James Hostica. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Is that a question?
Everybody gets it wrong. So one thing I heard about was this narrative that there's either grand halls or humble homes, and that forgets a really beautiful and important social tradition of the storefront church, especially in cities. And so that caught my ear. It also brings to mind 3 stories that I've lived personally. One of them was in a very, very small town in Southern Ohio where there was a Buddhist congregation, and they moved into a house, and slowly they started putting additions on the house, and slowly they started meeting there in bigger numbers and having events, and all of a sudden council was like, wait, you're out of zoning, and they said, try us, we're a religion. Council was toothless, and it caused problems for the character of the neighborhood with parking, vents, noise, and things like this. Second story is when I grew up in Old Brooklyn on the corner of Broadview and Natchez. There was connected right to my house. Now this was not residential, but it was a storefront. So, but it does still apply. His name was Pastor Jim. This was the late 70s, and everything was a little different. He was a hypno pastor. And I can promise you that his moving in absolutely changed the character of the neighborhood. The third story is a Pentecostal grifter by the name of Bob, who was in Parma, same era. My uncle was a bit of a grifter, and they were friends. They did worship in homes, and as his little home churches moved from home to home to home, what they left in their wake was boxes, messes, brooms. As they got bored with one house and moved to another, it was just neglect. And because they weren't residing there, there was no upkeep. So I'd just like to remind us that whether you're looking at 30 minutes of connection with Divine or $30 worth of Doritos, churches are businesses, and the impact on the infrastructure of a neighborhood is the same, right? Whether you're parking for a church or parking for a corner store, it's the same. And I'm concerned at some of the frankly toothless provisions of this, whereby we don't know how to define undue parking, right? We don't even have limits on how many can go in a neighborhood. So I would just like to remind us that we're opening a can of worms because it is for all religions. We don't know what the limits are. And a lot of us did not choose to purchase a home next to a place of worship for a reason. For the same reason I didn't choose to purchase a home next to the corner store. And so I would like to point us back to the beautiful and wonderful tradition of storefront churches and places of worship, which is a possibility, already is zoned for that, and which everybody has equal access to.
Cindy Carroll Pankhurst.
Cindy Carroll Pankhurst, I live on Maple Road. I have some very specific questions and a question about some particular wording. Mostly I want to talk about parking and traffic, but before I get there, I would like to know if there is any provision to limit the number of individuals who can live under a conditional use permit in a house of worship. Can an entire family live there? it's pertinent to me. I don't know if it matters to anybody else. With regard to parking and traffic, I'm not really worried about whether or not I'm going to be able to find a parking space on the street. What I am worried about is the fact that we're talking about residential neighborhoods, most of which have much narrower streets than other areas within the city. And if there is a lot of on-street parking, that affects the traffic flow and the traffic safety on those streets. And the last thing is the language that says conditional use shall be in conformance, not create an undue parking shortage, and any impacts on neighboring streets, homes, or businesses must be minimized to the extent possible, which means it means nothing. When you say to the extent possible, it means nothing. Lastly, I forgot one thing, now I gotta find it again. The idea of requiring applicants to include a parking plan is terrific, but it's being done by the applicant, so they're gonna make it work for them. I would argue that perhaps we could find some way to require a thorough, independent traffic study instead of just saying, here's my parking plan. That's all. Thank you.
Sarah Nokar?
Hi, I'm Sarah Nokar. I live on Wood. I just want to draw attention to the language in particular. I think actually this is a great endeavor. I think that obviously the community has a need for this. I think that just the wording, I mean, Cleveland Heights has clearly had some issues with wording lately, so I think that we need to be very smart about that. And so currently the one zoning, I don't know, I didn't put the number down, but places of worship in a residential place, it currently says that they can only be used for the purpose of a congregation, cannot be connected to a business except for the renting of rooms for a use that provides a service to the community. For example, a daycare, exercise class, meeting space, etc. This changes it to a community place of worship shall be used only for the local purposes of the congregation and shall only be used or operated for the sole purpose of the community place of worship, including short-term rental of rooms, daycares, preschools, schools, office space, coffee houses, stores, meeting spaces, and the place of worship. So like my thing is that those are businesses. They need text. That's all. Also, we're changing this from for the good of the community at large. The wording is saying for the community at large to the wording is saying only for the congregation, only for the sole purpose of the community place of worship. That is not a community place anymore. The reason that churches are tax exempt is because they are community organizations. Okay, so if you are no longer a community organization, you're only serving your congregation, why are you tax exempt? Why are we paying for that if we're not benefiting from that? If we're not invited to partake because we're not part of that congregation? I'm not allowed to be a part of that congregation. So I have that. For two, this also takes out that businesses can rent rooms for a use that provides a service to the community. This says businesses or that the community place of worship can rent rooms, but it takes out for the community, so it just says rent rooms. So what, you can just have rental property because it's tied to the congregation? This is confusing. These things need cleared up. These things can be taken advantage of by bad actors. I'm not saying that there are bad actors, but there could be. We don't know. you know?
Right, unfortunately, time's up, but thank
Sorry.
you. Does anybody want to address that? Jessica Cohen, Director Zanft? Assistant Director Knittel? We have a couple more?
Did you want me to address that now? Sure. The intent is really for the places of worship, and we were talking about the community place of worship, to still be able to offer meeting rooms and places. We often see civic groups meet in those locations. And so I think we can take a look at that language and clean it up so that it's more clear that that's truly the intent, is to continue in that capacity.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And so just to distinguish also, because a place of worship would be the primary use, the building and structure would be a place of assembly, so it would have to be constructed those terms. Currently, the neighborhood place of worship does not permit any accessory dwelling unit or a residential structure within that. It can only be used as a place of worship.
You're proposing that in this.
Hold on a second. We got to follow our protocol. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question about the counts, and it's, I think, somewhat all related, where you've got 8,000 square feet, under 8,000 square feet building, and it's 300 square feet per person, which essentially means that you're never going to get any more than 26.6 people per any of these structures. Is that correct?
Sure, and you have to remember too, there's building code regulations about maximum assembly space and how many people can be within that assembly space at any one time. So the zoning code's one thing, but then also the building code would require, sorry, I'm not getting what he's asking.
I think the standard that you're referring to is the 300 square feet of assembly space would require one parking space. So that doesn't limit the number of people who could be in a building, it's parking.
Yeah,
So there's really then no limits on the number of people that can be in a particular structure, except for fire codes. And it's like no more than 55 people allowed in this building,
Which is
this room.
for every use in every building in the city and throughout the country.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarification.
Joel Goldman?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, Joel? Okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Councilman Pash, I just want to say that it's not just the building codes. We just had a conditional use permit in the last 6 months or so where I don't even know what the building codes were, but we limited to any event to maximum 50 people. And if they wanted to change that use to more people, they would have to come back to amend their conditional use permit. So the Planning Commission actually has the authority to even layer that on top of code.
Aaron Laboris, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong.
So no Joel Goldman?
Aaron Lebovics, 3485 Shannon Road. I'm actually a rabbi in the Young Israel in the Hebrew Academy on Taylor Road. So I'm actually in support of my competition that has been opening up, people attempting to open up, prayers off of Taylor Road. So I'd support it. I want to point out about the taxes that because we don't drive on our holidays on Saturday, as was mentioned, so a home near a place of worship, we can have a 3-day holiday spending approximately, 5 hours a day in the synagogue. It's a very integral part of our culture. So for elderly people who can't walk, particularly in the winter, it's quite cold and difficult. People have fallen on the ice. Having a home near a synagogue raises the value of the home immensely. And I believe that if you have these places, and it's already kind of happening, the property values will go up so much because of the availability of this, integral type of place for our culture. That should more than make up the shortfall of whatever taxes these particular few places, because it's not going to be more than a few places because you need the people to pray there and support it. So that's one thing. I just want to say I appreciate Cleveland Heights. I've been here for 25 years. I support the city through my taxes, my tickets that I get. And you're all doing a great job. I was here for the other thing, and I appreciate the mayor, and no hard feelings. I know you're trying your best. We should just go in peace to the Hebrew word shalom. And the more we have this great opportunity for all the religions and everybody do their thing. I think it'll just continue that beautiful environment that I raised my children in of Cleveland Heights. Thank you.
Michael Harris.
I live on 3587 Severn Road, and again, I'm also in support of this. From the Jewish community perspective, this would certainly be a big benefit for people moving here, having places close. Rocco Berger and Rabbi Levix mentioned the point. I just want to reiterate that it really is a real thing, getting to these places for the elderly people and people getting up in age with canes and walkers, and it's really difficult. And that's a real thing that we consider, because we want our children there, but we want our children, we like the range of people. From little children should see older people, and we like that whole spectrum. It shouldn't be that only certain people can come to shul when they're well and when they're able-bodied. And so we really have to be, as a physician in rehab medicine, that's something I'm very sensitive to, that really be open to that idea. And I think it will increase property values. And, you know, from the Jewish perspective, we have some of these shuls here now. We're not looking to rent rooms. We're looking to have places that are convenient for people to get to. Thank you.
Christopher Brace.
Hey, good evening, folks. Let's see if we can get this adjusted. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. The zoning code is a living document. It reflects, you know, how we live, how we eat, work, shop, pray. And our zoning code hasn't really been meaningfully updated in about 60 years. I am not an expert, but I will rely on people older than me here to tell me that the world has changed a lot in the last 60 years, in a few ways, one or two. And I think that it's time that we took a serious eye at updating our zoning code to match the ways in which we live today. One of those ways that is, you know, very personal to many people in Cleveland Heights is how we pray. And this legislation, this zoning change, legalizes what is already happening in our city and cities around the country. In my backyard, there's a church that's been converted into condominiums because its congregation grew too small and they had to move out to another building, a neighborhood district, or a home. Other, you know, other places of worship have come up in homes. All places of worship at some point or another started in someone's living room. This change merely extends the spectrum of the places of worship that are allowed in Cleveland Heights, creating these more local places, community places that are walkable, that are accessible, that maybe don't require driving to get to, that allow our communities to worship and pray in the ways that are accessible to them, local to them, and home to them. I support this initiative and others to make our city's zoning more flexible, to open it to all, and to give us an opportunity to enter the 21st century. Thank you.
That's all, Mr. President.
All right. Any other last minute questions from council? We actually have another meeting in another room. Maybe I could ask Director Zanf one question. I know that Beechwood has legislation that's similar to this, but it has some differences. Could I ask what the differences are and why we chose the path we did if it differs from the Beechwood path?
I think that we did look at the Beechwood legislation. In fact, the FAQ is inspired by Beechwood. And the big difference there is that the Beechwood parcels and the layout of that city is quite different. They don't necessarily have neighborhoods as tight-knit as a land use pattern as ours. So those places of worship standards have much greater setbacks, much more akin to our community places of worship. So we had to take a look at it, use it as some inspiration, but it's somewhat of a square peg in a round hole.
Got it. All right, yes, go ahead.
There were a couple things that I wanted, I would hope that planning could address just briefly if possible. about some of the major changes that occurred between the original version of this change, which I withdrew and, asked to have a little bit more work done on it to bring it back. And this version, I think that there's some pretty meaningful changes that I think maybe put some things in perspective. And I also wanted to ask if maybe we could revisit sort of the inapplicability. I know you touched on it a little bit, but there was some talk, I think, in the original conversation about RLUPA. And I think in subsequent discussion with law, we sort of realized that we don't have to do this in order to be in compliance with that or anything like that. But I wanted, if you could just touch on that as well, to provide a little bit of context there too.
So the mayor mentions RLUPA, which is the Federal Religious Land Use Protection Act, I think, RLUPA. And that is a federal law that protects religious land uses in many communities where those restrictions were deemed to be very strict. And so we did have this conversation going through the first iteration. And at the time, even discussing it, the idea that we were making land use more flexible for religious uses made that concern about RLUPA kicking in not a concern. And certainly we feel like having run this second iteration through that same lens, that it also doesn't, we're not putting more restrictions on religious uses, we're adding opportunities. So we don't believe that we're running afoul of that. And in terms of the differences between iteration 1 and iteration 2, it really is a much better product, a much better ordinance that came out of the first iteration, the withdrawal and the re-examination. I'll let Karen speak more specifically to it. We highlighted some of this in our presentation, but in the first iteration, we were struggling with how do we treat places of worship in neighborhoods? How do we deal with that real specific parking issue that we know is an issue? And so I think we were sort of twisting ourselves into a pretzel to try to figure that out. But then we realized it's really this more global standard that and a process that we needed to apply for all conditional uses, because we were experiencing that at the Planning Commission where conditional uses were not being good neighbors and people were complaining about these conditional uses, auto uses and things like that. And the problem was they didn't have a parking plan. So this idea that every conditional use, every non-residential use in a residential district requires this parking plan was a really big game changer. And I think the biggest difference between the two.
I would agree. I think the biggest change, and as I said it previously, for the better, I think for all conditional uses, was that aha moment where we realized this needed to be a standard, a general standard for all conditional uses in terms of parking and landscaping. I think we also tweaked a little bit about setbacks, asking the neighborhood places of worship match the existing setback of existing single-family homes, so making sure that it matched that character of the neighborhood, I think was another one of those tweaks that took place. So I do think that just by taking that extra time and going back and looking again and at just thinking through how structures fit into our neighborhood and how it's contextual and using our Gridix software to try to analyze how a building might fit into each neighborhood. And we tried looking at lots of different lots and parcels and tried to think this through. I think that just helped us get to where we are with this code, where it is now.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This was, I'm so glad we got a chance to air this out a bit. I'm just about, did you want to say one last thing? Okay, we're good. We are just about to conduct a special committee of the whole meeting in the conference room. This meeting is adjourned at 7:15.